Every day, we're here for you. We get things off the ground, keeping you connected. We're here keeping you safe and secure. We keep things running smoothly and know the importance of giving back. Every day, we're here. ARA, here for you, here for good.
Welcome to Everyday Greatness, and thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Barnaby Howarth. We're coming to you from Sydney Swans HQ in Moore Park, and today I'm sitting down with one of the most fascinating people in Australia, clinical psychologist and former elite athlete, Suzie Rhydderch. Before I start though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, the Gadigal and Bidjigal people. I'd like to extend my respect to elders past, present and emerging. One of the proudest things I can say about myself is that I am Australian. So I give this acknowledgement from the heart. Suzie and I are going to talk about how you can want to win everything but still be a mentally balanced person at the same time. If there were ever an epidemic of pigs being released onto the Sydney cricket ground during Sydney Swans games, the person you'd want to employ to round those pigs up would be somebody who's previously released a pig onto the SCG. The same goes for who you'd want to employ to understand how elite athletes think. You'd want somebody who's been there and done that before. And that's exactly what the Sydney Swans have done when they employed Suzie Rhydderch as their clinical psychologist. Suzie is a psychologist at the Sydney Swans and Insight Elite Performance Psychology. Suzie was a 1,500 metre runner and wanted to compete at the Olympic Games. But as a 21-year-old, her hopes were dashed when she had a fall in a race and broke a hip and needed a hip replacement. Suzie says she didn't have an eating disorder, but admits that her bones were brittle from her drive to succeed. So who better to be the psychologist at the Sydney Swans than somebody who's been to the brink of elite performance and seen the damage it can do to a person. So it's a pleasure to welcome to Everyday Greatness clinical psychologist Suzie Rhydderch. Suzie, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Barnaby. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the clinical psychology question. Most professional sports teams have an elite sports psychologist. Why did the Sydney Swans choose to have a clinical psychologist instead?
I guess when I started in this role, I probably asked the same thing. I didn't have a background in AFL. I didn't do a master's in sports psychology. But it was pretty obvious to me from what was in place when I took over the role that the club valued the well-being of the playing group and arguably, the person before the athlete potentially. And I think that's, whilst we're all psychologists, sports and performance and clinical. I guess the area of focus is a little bit different in terms of clinical psychology is looking at mental health and mental ill health and making sure that the playing group have good mental health to be able to perform, whereas perhaps a sports and performance psychologist is looking at the performance aspect first and its relationship to mental health, but potentially needing to refer out if there are clinical presentations or ill health that they need to be able to manage, whereas I feel like my training enables me to manage both skills, but I certainly need to kind of get my supervision and my guidance from others that specialise more in the sports and performance space to be able to do my job, effectively as well.
So sports organisations, professional sporting organisations exist primarily to maximise on-field results. What do you offer the Sydney Swans as a clinical psychologist that elite sports psychologists couldn't offer?
Well, I don't know that that's actually, I don't know that I can offer to something, especially different. I guess, your introduction about being an athlete once upon a time probably gives me that string to my bow. But then I feel confident through my training as a clinical psych and my scientist training that I'm making sure that our athletes are not letting mental ill health get in the way of their performance, and that if things do occur because life throws curveballs at them or the environment is incredibly stressful, that whilst training and performing at the elite level, I'm simultaneously managing their mental health needs. And that's perhaps, what makes a clinical psychologist a really relevant part of the whole high performance space in a sporting club.
Speaking of high performance, you wanted to be a high performance athlete yourself. Where did you dream you'd get to when you were 18 years old?
I was definitely working towards Olympic selection and I guess, the world champs and Com Games and everything that kind of comes with that, that level of performance. Was training like an elite athlete, had the mindset of an elite athlete, had probably the imbalance of an elite athlete in lots of ways, which is something I guess was my greatest undoing, and something I bring into my work today is, advocating for balance and other things going on in people's lives. So, I was pretty narrow-minded with my focus and sport was everything and everything else was just a bit of an afterthought, including my studies and, even relationships and things like that. So I was pretty dogged in my pursuit of trying to make it to the top. But, just didn't quite get there.
And in your dogged pursuit to get to the top, what sacrifices did you make to try and make it to the top of the mountain?
It's funny, I know this probably sounds really cliched, but I didn't think of them as sacrifices at the time. I really enjoy training. And so, allocating all my spare time to training, working, really hard with my coach, was just kind of part of my DNA. I didn't feel like I was sacrificing social opportunities. I was able to study at the same time. So I guess, in a lot of ways I was kind of maintaining two levels of sort of kind of high performance. Probably definitely what I didn't factor in or kind of prioritise was the recovery aspect of training. I think working in a high performance setting here, I see the athletes spend, an equal amount of time making sure that they recover, that they fuel their bodies, that they acknowledge, the efforts that they've put in and take that downtime. And I sacrificed that, if anything. So it was never a sacrifice about, I was always doing too much training, I guess. And as a young athlete without a professional system around them, I was uneducated too about the costs of my training. And so, made the ultimate sacrifice in terms of a career-ending injury.
And just while you were competing, did you witness any of your competitors make really unhealthy sacrifices and hurt themselves as a result?
In truth, I didn't. But as a result of my injury, it became a pretty interesting story around the track and around the traps. And I then learned, some other athletes had probably, in the background made similar choices to me in terms of overtraining, under-eating, under-fueling their body. But I probably wasn't aware of it at the time. It's a pretty invisible thing, to be able to just train really hard and not do the kind of the recovery and the nourishing of the body in the background. So I wasn't aware of that happening at the time, but certainly after my injury, a lot of female athletes in track and field in particular came out and spoke openly about the pressures they felt to perform or to look a certain way or to be a certain weight, all of which was, I thought was a pretty invisible kind of lonely journey that I was on, but turns out it was a pretty common challenge for other athletes.
So give us some insight into that world. In the competitive athletics world, can healthy people win races now, or do you have to make those unhealthy sacrifices to win?
No, I think it's the healthy ones that are still having the long careers, the sustainable careers and the success. I mean, I was really misguided in some of my decisions and, the blame of that responsibility sits squarely on my shoulders. But the athletes that go on to have successful careers are educated, listening to their coaches and their team around them, and their bodies ultimately. I actually firmly believe it's impossible to be successful for a long period of time with a really restrictive regime or just a completely out of balance relationship between training and rest and recovery and nutrition, things like that.
In saying that then, and this is a question without notice, what are your thoughts on the enhanced games? Is that beneficial or terrible, or what's your thoughts on it?
That is out of left field. I don't know. Haven't sort of thought too much about that. I mean, I think you're talking about in terms of performance enhancing.
Correct.
Yeah. I think that's a leap too far. Like I think athletes can get by with good quality nutrition and whole foods and education around that. I appreciate I'm in an environment where, you know, athletes are right at the edge of getting the most out of their bodies and they, you know, would be supplementing with vitamins and, you know, minerals and things to be able to kind of enhance the intake that they have. But as far as taking it a step further and kind of looking into the edgy side of drugs and things like that, I don't know, it's like Pandora's box. I can't see how that actually aids athletes to be healthier, and I think the long-term consequences of that are probably just as devastating as some of the choices that I made.
Thank you for answering that question. As you were answering, I thought that's probably not an appropriate question to ask a psychologist in an interview, but thank you for answering.
That's all right.
So tell us about your work here at the Swans. How do you use your experience as an elite athlete when you diagnose players here at the Swans?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I'm not hugely in the business of diagnosis, partly because our playing group is pretty healthy. You know, sport and exercise is a really protective factor for people's mental health. So we see the rates of diagnosable mental illness as less in this environment than I do in my private practice or in, you know, the world outside. I use diagnosis when it's a helpful communication tool with another health professional, or as part of the education piece with athletes around, you know, what they're describing to me sounds like this kind of cluster of symptoms or this sort of presentation, and that then informs my treatment approach as such. But so that, I guess that's the bit about the diagnostics. But in terms of my own experience, it's important not to make my work or, you know, my relationship with athletes about me or my story. I mean, I hope it kind of weaves its way in through empathy and understanding in terms of the mindset and some of the choices they might make or some of the stresses that they're experiencing. But it rarely my story rarely features in the room. I think when I first started and people were a bit perplexed about, you know, where I fitted in to the playing group, I probably, or it was certainly kind of advertised a bit like you did at the start of the interview today about, you know, I had these dreams. I've thought like athletes. I've kind of put my body on the line, but I've also paid a really big price for it. So this is essentially going to be a case of do as I say, not as I do, learn from my mistakes. And I guess when I'm, you know, especially working with people that I can see are on a pathway similar to perhaps what I was, I'll probably be a little bit more forthright with my warning signs and my advocacy for, again, sort of rest, recovery, nutrition, education, because I can't help but want to steer people off a different, you know, I don't want people to go down that trajectory. It was painful and costly. But, yeah, I don't see so much of that in this environment, perhaps working, I mean, of course, boys and men can experience poor body dissatisfaction and eating disorders, but I don't see it as frequently in this environment.
Very good answer. We live in a society now where it almost feels like there's no pride in your performance unless you win. How do you tell Sydney Swans footballers, men and women, and boys and girls in the academy, that you can try your hardest and be proud of yourself whether you win, lose or draw, and make it not sound like you're accepting mediocrity or celebrating second best?
I saw your question when I was thinking about this answer, and I mean, part of what's going on externally, I think, is that we are putting too much emphasis on results, you know, and you see kids winning awards for just turning up, you know, and so I think in some respects we're putting too much emphasis on the importance of winning, and kids that turn into adults aren't used to not winning or, you know, that sort of feeling of defeat or needing to do something different to improve. And so I think one of the challenges is people that are coming through need to experience setbacks and adversity and arguably failure to be really hungry and to strive really hard for the end result. But I also am really passionate about not being so focused on the end result and because that's so uncontrollable in so many ways. You know, people can absolutely train hard and do everything right, and the end result still doesn't come. So if we can pull it right back to being about their mindset and about their process and what they can control, now that's of more interest to me because that's kind of modifiable, and that's what empowers people to keep trying, is that they can keep working on those things. So I'm sort of unashamedly not as focused on the result and not celebrating that end piece, which is hard because that's the narrative in the media and common society, and the athletes themselves certainly relish in those wins. But and I think the thing is, when we start talking about process and mindset, it's always like there's always something to tweak, or there's always something to improve on. So there's no room for complacency when we start talking about process. If you start getting focused on results and you win, naturally complacency can creep in because it's like, oh, I've done the job, tick, But if you pull it back to how did we win, and how did we nearly lose, or how did we not, get this bit right? It just kind of keeps the hunger there because there's always something to keep striving for.
That's a very cool answer. It's very nice to hear from a psychologist who knows what they're talking about. The question that would come up for a lot of people, and I know people personally that ask this question, how does being a well-balanced person away from the sporting field or tennis court or golf course, wherever they're in, how does being a well-balanced human being help them win their game of sport?
It's probably something that the players sometimes struggle with is seeing the value in that balance, and certainly I put my hand up and say I was one of those athletes that thought it was like more is better, do more, be better, all those kinds of cliches. And it wasn't just the cost to me in terms of the injury, but it was just, again, like in hindsight, what it cost me in terms of my social development, my personal development, because I was so fixated on running at the time. But now when I work with athletes, there's something really important about being able to switch off from your sport, being switched on or dialed on all the time to thinking about, analysing, ruminating on sport is not actually advantageous for performance. It's draining, it's costly, it can become pretty preoccupying and pretty self-focused, whereas to be able to switch off and pick up, whether it's study or volunteer work or, hobbies and interests and relationships outside of sport, not only does it diversify your identity, which is really important because one day being an athlete will come to an end. And so, to be able to invest in other parts of your identity and your self-worth whilst you're playing at the elite level or performing at the elite level is really important for the future, but certainly for the now, because sport also has lots of threats in it. It's hugely rewarding, but it's got injuries and it's got poor form and it's got non-selection and it's got contract negotiations. It's got all these kind of ever-present threats. And if all you think about or all you have available to you or all your eggs are in the sport basket, when that thing is not going well, how do you possibly feel good about yourself, or how do you possibly talk about yourself in another way? Whereas as soon as you've got, a variety of interests or skills or achievement coming from other parts of your life, then when you switch on to sport, it's more enjoyable. When you switch on to sport, you're more present. When you switch on to sport, you're more hungry. So that's indirectly how it helps with performance and winning as such.
Very cool. In saying all of that, what are some of the tips you give to professional sports people when they're a bit overwhelmed and all their eggs in the sport basket? What are some of the tips you give to them that everyday Joe Bag of Donuts can use in their own personal life?
Well, I guess, you could take out the word sport from that kind of sole focus and say it's my job or it's my kids or it's my relationship. If there's just one thing that a person's got on their mind, it's a little bit fraught with danger. It makes you quite vulnerable when that thing is not going well. So I had a conversation with a player this morning that recognised they were feeling pretty flat and just kind of going through the motions, doing everything right, coming into training, not missing any sessions, but just didn't have that spark to it. And I said, well, you know, what else have you been doing outside of sport? And they said, well, outside of training. They said, well, nothing, because I feel like I've just got to double down on my training. I said, well, how's that working for you? You know, and the answer is, well, it's not. I'm just feeling even more burnt out and even less motivated. So I said, well, you know, you may or may not like the answer, but the key to getting better in your performance is not actually to do more in terms of your performance, but, you know, obviously you've got a standard that you've got to meet as far as training goes, but, you know, reinvest in your uni. You know, pick up your hobbies and your interests. What's your morning routine like? Have you got anything that you get up for that's other than training and work, you know? Oh, that's right. I used to go down to the beach and grab a coffee and chat with the boys. That sounds like a really good place to start. You know, what are you doing of an evening? Well, you know, I'm not feeling so great, so I'm just going home. Well, you know, the very thing that was going to make you feel better is grab dinner with the boys, or, you know, speak to Kirky about what kind of volunteer opportunities are going on around the club. Shift your perspective, get out of your own head and start looking at, you know, the world through somebody else's lens. We do some really great work with Red Kite at the hospital, or Whatability, or, you know, any of the other kind of connections that we have within the community. Sometimes just being able to, put your stuff down and pause a little bit and get into someone else's shoes, or just look at the world through a different perspective. And I mean that for our players as well as I mean for, you know, as you say, Joe Bag of Donuts.
Joe Bag of Donuts.
Is really important and hugely within our control and really accessible. We sometimes just need to be a bit creative and kind of wrestle with the idea that doing more is not always better. And then it can be more enjoyable, more quality, more present. If we, you know, once we put that thing down, we can pick it up again later and it's a little bit more rewarding for us.
Incredible advice. I know a lot of people that do well to listen to what you've just said. Suzie Rhydderch, I said at the start you're one of the most incredible people in Australia, and that just confirmed that interview. So thank you, Suzie, for joining us on Everyday Greatness.
Thanks, Barnaby. That's way too favourable, but thank you.
And thank you to the Sydney Swans for hosting us so graciously in your incredible headquarters. Thank you to the ARA Group for being our major sponsor for the 7th year in a row. Thank you to Look Studio Australia for your technical expertise. Thank you to Facet Digital for your digital marketing services. And thank you all for listening or watching. And I hope you can join us next week, where I'll speak to New South Wales Swifts netballer Sophie Fawns. We'll be talking about how young sports people can be shaping the culture of organisations without even realising it. We hope you can join us for that one. But if you'd like to find out more about this show, go to the Everyday Greatness page at www.barnabyhowarth.com.au, or follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube or LinkedIn, or you can catch us on Swans TV. But thank you again for watching and listening.